I know how things are right now. Things are kind of all over the place. It's hard to find time to squeeze everything in.
It's okay. This is a perfect time. I'm in the midst of writing up a affidavit for a court procedure, and it ought to be very interesting. Put it that way.
That's great. Yeah, I'm just doing some research over here. I'm starting to look into the early kind of connections between the history that leads up to Muhammad, and so there's like a lot of interesting details. The Byzantine Empire, who's over in
Byzantine,
like the Byzantine Empire, who ultimately it's the Emperor Leo the First, who has a in this kind of little research I'm doing, has a military alliance with the Ghassanids, who are ultimately going to help Qusay. And Qusay is the great grandfather of Muhammad, who really went in there and took control of Mecca, and who helped restore the Kaaba. So the Kaaba and Mecca were a center city of worship like a couple of centuries before Muhammad even came in the picture. So this individual Qusay, who's the great grandfather of Muhammad, was taking military control over the region. I think it's like in 470 to 500 AD. And he put a roof on the Kaaba, and he built houses all around the region in Mecca. And basically he had the support of the Ghassanids, who were a military mercenaries of the Byzantine Emperor Leo the First. So I'm starting to like kind of dig into what was happening structurally there, like in this, because ultimately the Kaaba, apparently, according to Islamic tradition, was built by Ishmael. So, and it was filled with 350 different idols in there. And it was a center of, I guess, Ishmaeli paganism and idolatry. So it's very interesting.
Yes, it is.
But I'm glad I got a chance to jump on here with you. As I'm looking at here, it looks like I'm looking at my news feed, and it looks like the Panama conflict is heating up as China detains dozens of cargo ships.
Yeah.
So it looks like...
remember, China got control of the locks run by Hutchinson Whampoa, which is their company, through the works of 33rd degree Freemason Jimmy Carter, who gave Panama and the locks to the Red Chinese at the advice of his Jesuit advisor. So that's very important. So it looks like the order is going to play a Panama card with Red China now. And if they're going to do that, of course, there's another canal through Nicaragua that's huge, but if they're going to do that, that will escalate things.
Yep, that's what the article is talking about. The Federal Maritime Commission is closely monitoring the situation. Apparently, the U.S. has gotten in there and broken Beijing's stronghold with their, like you said, Whampoa Hutchinson control over the locks there, and now I guess they're starting to flag vessels here, and they're starting to, and it's interesting because they're starting to exercise military power way outside of their particular hemisphere. So I'm trying to understand how this is going to work for them. I don't really recognize, I don't see China as having like a massive military fleet that they have military strength, of course, but they don't seem to have the kind of, maybe they're doing this because so much of America's military is over in Iran right now.
Yeah, it could be. Could very well be. Of course, the Chinese Secret Intelligence Service and the CIA work together. So that's why they have all their high technology was given to them. So and I have a picture of Jesuit General, what was his name? He was the Basque before Sosa. I have a picture of him running the locks in Panama. So the Jesuits in control of Panama and the locks through Red China. And Red China was built by, put in power, Mao was put in power in 1949 by the State Department, as proven by the John Birch Society. So this is a tool of the order to begin to drive the Americans into the new right and desperation, because we have to all unite to now resist Red China and they're probably going to detonate a few things here and blame Iran for it, or maybe China, as I've said in my book, to then further drive everybody unquestionably into the new right. So I look at it as that's probably the tactic of what they're doing, because China doesn't have any navy to speak of. It has a huge shipping fleet of 7,000 container ships, but they don't have, I think they only have 2 or maybe 3 aircraft carriers, but they have a huge fifth column here, and some of it's within the CIA, so they're able to coordinate with their intelligence people back in Red China. So it's all going to be coordinated against us somehow, some way, to drive us into the new right. Because China's not invading, not yet.
Yeah, I think you're right. We see that the military is in the Middle East, in the Navy, and you've been calling for some time for there to be a major strike, a betrayal of the Navy, so that they're greatly diminished. And so I wonder, like, the situation is very precarious over there. I think that our Navy is in a position where it's very vulnerable. I think that the military power of the United States military is incredibly advanced. But at the same time, if you have people on the inside who are steering the events so that they are made more vulnerable by an attack, it becomes a situation where you could see the military naval assets that we have become diminished to such an extent that it would be harder to defend America.
That's correct. I maintain that's going to happen after the culmination of the two-front war, because the Jesuits have to, destroy the mosques in Jerusalem. Maybe they might even destroy the Mecca and Medina mosques too. Then blame the U.S. for it to incite the whole Muslim Sunni world against us. They could pull that card, or they could, meanwhile, to have something happen with Red China to draw off American Navy over to Red China. I had a student whose son was a pilot in the Navy, and he was ready to retire. And they called him in and said, "We believe," and this was happened about 3 years ago, so "we believe we will be going to war with China within the next 5 years. And they said, we would like you to reconsider re-enlisting, and we'll give you, a $50,000 bonus, because the South China Sea better than anybody that we know of. And it would be an effective pilot." So they're anticipating war. They're going to have a war. That's why they built their islands there in the Pacific. And that's why they've weakened Hawaii, so it can be successfully invaded and betrayed to invasion. So they're putting their pieces together here. And they also have a huge Chinese fifth column in Canada. So it's a surrounding policy. They're going to take the Pacific. That's what they want to do. And to facilitate that, I maintain the Joint Chiefs of Staff will deliberately make wrong decisions to cause the Navy to lose a key battle or something along those lines. But they were going to betray and scuttle the Navy probably in the Pacific when it's preoccupied in the Middle East.
No, it seems like that the betrayal of America by the political elite is fully underway, both on the Republican and Democrat side. You can see that the move towards securing the elections is not happening. Any move towards holding people responsible in Minnesota for their massive fraud by the Somalians that they brought in. So you can see it's this back and forth seesaw effect between the left and the right, where it's a continuous agitation that just doesn't seem to be with any resolution.
Yes, perfectly said. Continual agitation against the whites of this country without any resolution to drive them into the new right, because they've weaponized the blacks against us since the 1960s. That's their weapon against us. Their weapon is also the military government that uses them. Their weapon is also economics. Their weapon is also betrayal of us and with our friends overseas, so that we don't have any allies anymore for the most part. All of this is a continual, ceaseless agitation to drive us right where the Jesuits want to take us, into the new right, and then ultimately the two-front war, the betrayal of our troops after they killed targeted populations, and then our Sino-Soviet Muslim invasion. And there's a good book that has to do something with this. It's called The Year of the Rat, where Clinton gave all our high military technology to the Red Chinese. Clinton gave our torpedo technology that Our torpedoes travel 240 miles an hour underwater, where only the tip of the torpedo hits the water. So it can slam into an aircraft carrier and sink it or go right through it. But all that technology that China has was given to them by Bill Clinton and others, the Jesuit.
It's interesting. You can see that the pressure from in Canada is incredible, because they have this kind of weird banker, like London banker guy up there, Carney, and he's going to go to China to basically like kiss the ring over there and offer them to bring in policing and military assets into China, like literally like importing into Canada. I'm sorry, into Canada, right? And bringing like policing and military assets into Canada, and to literally like import our most dangerous enemy right into the region. And so it's incredible that, and of course, Canada doesn't really have any kind of military institution of its own. It doesn't really have the ability to fight or defend itself. It's just kind of relied on American military might for its own security for all this time. So it's incredible that they have become such a belligerent and dangerous traitor of their own like hemisphere by bringing in or making these kind of deals with China to their own detriment,
Right, and the detriment's going to be Trump or whoever the leader is going to say, listen, China has invaded Canada. There's treason in Canada. Of course, they won't tell you the Jesuits have facilitated this to justify the American absorption of Canada into the empire. That's exactly what Hitler did in 1938 with his Anschluss when he invaded Austria and absorbed Austria into the Reich. And that is exactly what I predicted for over 20 years, where the U.S. will invade Canada and bring it in. All the Canadians, they'll be delighted about it. But the government of Canada will be toppled, and the Jesuits running that government, no one's going to be put to death for treason, but it's going to be taken over, and Canada will be part of the empire with all of its huge natural resources in conjunction with Greenland. So that's what they're facilitating here.
Yeah, the North American Union. And it's interesting because it seems like this development of the North American Union and to build up this particular kind of imperial, regional, supranational government, it's almost like the European Union alignment is kind of underway with the taking of Venezuelan oil and the kind of toppling of the Venezuelan government, which of course they were completely corrupt, and they had already kind of nationalized American assets decades ago. And also the preparation to really take Cuba is underway. And so all this kind of alignment seems to be the predicate for having the fuel and petroleum resources needed to go to war with China.
Well, that's the take. Because remember, we have Prudhoe Bay with that huge pipeline that comes down from the North Slope of Alaska into Alaska, into Anchorage area, I believe, and even to the U.S. And all that oil goes to Japan. So we could be completely dependent upon our own oil. The criminals who made us dependent on foreign oil, particularly in the Middle East, did this for this reason. That's why they shut down the oil wells. That's why they gave the largest commercial deal in history in 1934 to the Saudis with their oil concession deal that you can read about in Robert Lacey's book, The Kingdom, the Saudi Kingdom. And so that we've been deliberately made dependent upon foreign oil to justify these martial attacks and advances in the creation of their North American Union.
Yeah, but it's the exact model that you see that is the European Union, which is kind of turning all the different ancient and cultural legacies of the nations of Europe, Italy and France and all these different nations into just little colonies, little county districts in a larger kind of imperial structure.
Yeah, and Brussels. Excuse me, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking how the British kind of got out of it with Brexit, but they're just being terribly punished now with their leadership. It doesn't seem like it really served them any good because now they're being overrun with invaders. Londonistan.
Yeah, the black Muslims, some blacks and the savage Muslims, that's right. Robbing, raping, and pillaging to drive those apostate white British people who have abandoned the King James Bible, have abandoned the Reformation into the arms of the Pope running the European Union, because they have to have a common enemy. All these nations, whether they were historically white Protestant or white Catholic, have to have a common enemy. So the common enemy are all these Muslim invaders they brought in. So that would serve to unite the nations of Europe under a military dictator, because that's exactly what Martin Lee talks about in his book, The Beast Reawakens. There's going to be a new right there in Europe and a new right here.
Yeah, that looks like this is the policy of the World Economic Forum. It's being implemented internationally. And you can see that it's interesting. I was watching Jack Posobiec's comments on social media. It appears that some of these Roman Catholics are very upset because the Israelis have closed the doors and locked out some of the archbishops in Israel from going into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and some of their, so they can't do their Easter services. And I was commenting to Jack Posobiec. I was commenting to him I was saying, Israel isn't Rome. Why don't these Roman priests just go back to Rome and practice their rituals at home in Rome? You guys don't have a right to these locations. So it's very interesting because they're very worried about America first. They're very concerned about Israeli influence in America, but they have no quandary, no issue with Roman foreign influence all over the world.
Well, right. And, because it's an empire. You have to read the book Vatican Empire by Nino Labello. He also writes Vatican USA, and he also wrote the Vatican Papers. And he shows you that it's one huge international empire of which the Pope is king, and all the nations are subordinate to it. And that's canon law, that the Pope has the right to rule the governments of all nations at the temporal power of the Pope. So that's what we have there, and also nobody's going to admit that the government of Israel is run by the Jesuits. So they would have Netanyahu and others forbid the meeting in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the most sacred and holy, quote-unquote, edifice in the Middle East for the papacy. It's more important than the Dome of the Rock is to the Muslims. So if that Church of the Holy Sepulchre comes under some sort of damage, the Vatican will go ape over it. And it seems like that might be another thing they're going to do to destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, of which the Knights of the Equestrian Order guard, and also to bring down the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount. But as you know, the government of Israel is run completely by the Pope. So we should always refer to it as the government of Israel versus the people of Israel who have a right to the land.
No, you're right. People are in this kind of conspiracy turbulence, this turbine of the conspiracy community, where they're really obsessed about thinking about Israel and the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of this new Israeli state in the land, and how it was set up and how it's really, controlling the whole region. And it makes me think of these ancient churches like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and these ancient outposts of the papal knighthood orders who have been in that area operating long before 1948.
Right.
So it's very interesting how they fail to see the underlying power structure and the power elite and the papal nobility who really are controlling vast real estate in that area, but they just focus on this 1948 kind of novelty of the Israeli government being set up there recently.
Yeah, and they never want to talk about the Knights of Malta involved, like the father of Kim Philby, who was a traitor to Great Britain. Sir John Philby was a Knight of Malta, and he helped facilitate the setting up of what would later become the government of Israel. And there's a book called Treason in the Blood by Anthony K. Brown. It's a very important book. You want to read it. And a lot of it has to do with Sir John Philby and his son, Kim Philby.
Treason in the Blood.
Treason in the Blood by that tremendous author who wrote C and one on Donovan, Anthony K. Brown. He's a British author, I believe.
Okay. Just make a little note here if I can get my pen to work. Anthony K. Brown.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So let's kind of go back and talk a little bit about some of your legal work that you've been doing for all these years, and tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. I'll try to make it simple because boiling it down, it is simple. Okay. Since 1938, with the Erie decision of the Supreme Court, which was a criminal decision, the Supreme Court decided that there was no more federal general common law. Not general common law. That's after 1938. They imposed that. But there's no more federal general common law as protected by Swift versus Tyson of 1842. So it's almost 100 years after the Supreme Court had protected federal general common law that they did away with it in 1938 with the Erie decision. And there was the question before the court had nothing to do with that. So they did away with federal general common law when the question wasn't even before the court. And you can see that in the dissent of Erie. By the way, they had a Jew give the opinion, Louis Brandeis, so they can ultimately blame the Jews one day for the Erie decision. So what you have is the imposition of the federal military jurisdiction conferred by Congress on the district courts in 1917 to enforce Trading with the Enemy Act during World War I. Well, that's just fine during war, and when the Trading with the Enemy Act's in effect, that's just fine. But after the war, they did not repeal the Trading with the Enemy Act. And the military jurisdiction conferred on the district courts, the Article III courts, stayed in place. But when the Erie decision took place and they ousted civilian due process of Article III of the Constitution, immediately what filled the vacuum was the military jurisdiction of the Trading with the Enemy Act, which is Section 17, which is codified at 50 U.S.C. 4316. That's the jurisdiction that every federal district court sits in. None of them sit in civilian due process, law, or equity, or admiralty maritime. None of them. It's all military jurisdiction, evidenced by the military flags that are flown in every court. Okay? So my big purpose was to help us not to be subject to emergency war powers military jurisdiction. But what they did was, when FDR seized everything on March 9th, 1933, every person, place, or thing was seized. And then on that same day, when the Emergency Banking Relief Act was proclaimed to be passed by Congress, Congress approved and confirmed every proclamation of the President and Secretary of Treasury, beginning with the inauguration of FDR on March 4th, 1933. So it's carte blanche approval of those proclamations and all the executive orders that proceed from them. So now what happens is when they agreed to that, so now we're under emergency war powers military government, everybody's seized, all the property is seized, all the property in this country belongs to the commander-in-chief, he has legal title to it. But 5 years later, when the Erie decision, then they imposed the military jurisdiction for the military government to proceed against everybody that's deemed to be an enemy or a belligerent under Trading with the Enemy Act. They're now called persons under the Emergency Banking Relief Act. So this is what they did. So it's in every state court. They overlaid all the state constitutional civilian due process jurisdiction with this temporary emergency war powers federal military jurisdiction in every state court. So how can individuals be subject to a military jurisdiction? We had to have a status change. And the status change took place with the seizure on March 9th, 1933, when the commander-in-chief seized title to everything, which means the birth certificates. When the title to birth certificates was seized by the commander-in-chief, the property of those birth certificates, namely the individual, was also seized, and his status changed from being one of we the people to an enemy or belligerent under Trading with the Enemy Act, Emergency Banking Relief Act. So that changed our status, but we consented by our silence, even though we didn't know. It was totally legal, but they had preoccupied everybody with the Great Depression. So I have found a way to go back to the status that we all had before March 9th, 1933, And it has to do with a contract called a release. And your release must be filed in a court that enables you to go back to the status that we all had prior to March 9th, 1933. And then how to properly defend that. And that's what I'm doing now, so that there will be no court that can proceed against you with their emergency war powers military due process, whether it be a civil matter or a criminal matter. And I'm perfecting this right now with some affidavits I'm going to be putting into the county court in Dauphin County here. I have a friend that's been a victim of a sting operation for supposed going after a minor, no minor was involved. It was a police officer posing as a minor and texting with him, and so the statutes don't even apply to that. But getting more to the point, I have this individual friend of mine, and he has a declaration of status that's already been filed in the district court in Harrisburg, and we bring that in as a piece of evidence to show that this is his status, and you cannot give this emergency war powers military due process to me. It's a matter of public record. So you put it in the form of an affidavit, you give it to the prosecutor. We gave him 12 days to rebut. They never rebutted, so I'm putting together the notice of default to file into the court, and they admit to everything. So they admit to everything that we put in our previous filing. And if they admit to it, there's no controversy. And if there's no controversy, there's no litigation. There's no case to litigate, and the judge must dismiss. So that's what I'm working on, and because we're all going to be victims of this unless we learn how to properly stop this procedure.
So as we kind of examine how they're building it, because this is a long history, that like there's a lot here when you think about, when you go back through this long-term plan, going back to Lincoln, where the Civil War and that chaos was used to ultimately, what you discuss is destroy, alter, and reverse and the nature of citizenship in the United States, so that basically what you see is that the sovereign nation states that were ultimately giving a grant of power to the federal government to create the Constitution with permission, with enumerated powers, were ultimately subjected and dominated by that same federal power to become a national government, so that these nation states were no longer necessarily independent nation states, but became wholly owned subsidiaries of the national government that was built, so that the citizenship was changed. So people were no longer citizens of their states or their nation state, but they were national citizens of the United States of America.
Well, no. It reversed the origin and character of American citizenship. That's what the 14th Amendment did. 14th Amendment was not just for the blacks. It was for blacks and whites. And so it reversed the origin and character of citizenship that whites had, making citizenship national rather than federal. And then it conferred that national citizenship on the blacks and the Asians and whoever else. So we now have national citizenship. With national citizenship since 1868, we have a national government. And so that changed the relationship of the states to the national government, but they were still pretty much sovereign. They're going to piecemeal away that sovereignty, like with the 17th Amendment, which will give direct elections to the state senators, when the state senators are to be chosen by the state governments. The senators represent the state governments. The House of Representatives represents the people of the states. That's how it was to be. So when they shoved that 17th Amendment down our throats in 1913, along with the Federal Reserve Act, along with the 16th Amendment, it further centralized power in Washington, but they still had a civilian government. The coup de grace was when in 1933 they imposed the military government and temporarily ousted the civilian government. The problem is not 14th Amendment. The problem is not the D.C. in 1871, the District of Columbia Act. The problem that was laying the foundation for what they would do in 1933. And when they did that, they created a Holy Roman Empire of the United States of America. So I call it the Pope's Holy Roman 14th Amendment corporate fascist socialist communist American Empire. That's run by the Jesuits through Georgetown, Fordham, and their agents, the archbishops, and specifically the Archbishop of New York, who oversees the Council on Foreign Relations. That's what they did. It was a three-pronged thing. So 1868, 14th Amendment, 1871 with the centralizing power in D.C., and then 1933 with the creation of the empire. Consolidation and empire, just as Alexander Stephens wrote in his great work, A Constitutional View of the War Between the States. He was the vice president of the Southern Confederacy, and he said that's what our conquerors have in view. First, consolidation, and then empire. So consolidation is 1868, empire is 1933.
And what was that book you just mentioned there, Eric?
The Constitutional View of the War Between the States by Alexander Stephens, and it was written in 1867. It's a 2-volume set.
Okay.
Yep. Classic work.
Excellent. So the goal really wasn't to help the blacks get citizenship. If that was really the goal, they could have had state citizenship. They could have had the freed African-American slaves could have been citizens of the states. So that really wasn't what was in view. What was in view was taking away the sovereignty of the states, and very little is left of the constitutional framework that we originally started out with. We don't have money in gold and silver. We don't have our senators being elected from the state houses, right? They're just popularly elected. We don't have sovereignty of the individual, what were nation states, or they were independent and separate nation states. So the exact thing that the Southern Confederates, you might not like the fact that they were holding slaves, but they were fighting for the national sovereignty of their states, of their nations, and they ultimately lost that. And so did the northern states too. They lost their sovereignty as well.
Right. That's right. Remember, the Southerners were not fighting to maintain slavery. That's a great big communist lie by this communist academia. Second of all, slavery is not a sin. The Lord Jesus Christ healed slaves. He healed slaves of certain masters, and he never once told them to release their slaves. It's how you treat the slave that's the problem. And so there's nothing wrong with slavery. So we got to get out of this nonsense that slavery was America's original sin. That was put upon us by the British and others, like the French and others. We didn't want it. And Jefferson writes about that every time we tried to outlaw slavery in the colonies, the British king would nullify what we wanted to do. So anyways, the whole issue is not slavery. General Sherman, that criminal, with his son who became a Jesuit priest, Thomas Sherman. Sherman said when he went down, he said he didn't come down to free the slaves. He came down to save the Union. And when the blacks were running after the Yankee Union Army leaving Atlanta, Sherman ordered his cavalry to attack them with swords. So there's nothing about the Northerners that love the blacks of the South. And any black man in the South who knows any history knows that. So they just used them to kill whites of the South, and then on the ruins of that to seek to impose black supremacy on the South, which was then put an end to with the Ku Klux Klan, the first Ku Klux Klan. And so we have that taking place. But there wasn't this hatred between whites and blacks in the South until after the war between the states and during that filthy 12-year Reconstruction. So we have to realize that, but the Jesuits love that agitation. So in the meantime, they're going to make an empire out of America. They're going to use traitors like Robert E. Lee to call for the unification of the country. And we all need to accept this Yankee Union federal government or national government now so that they can have their wars like the war into Cuba with Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, and we're going to help out the Japanese, get rid of the samurai in 1879. Tom Cruise made a movie on that. And so it's going to become a power among nations to subject the nations to the political power of the Pope. But civilian government wasn't enough. They had to have military government under a commander-in-chief. And so when they pulled that off on March 9th, 1933, that's when the Jesuits took everything. They took all of our property. They imposed a military dictator called the commander-in-chief. And every commander-in-chief is inaugurated pursuant to the 20th Amendment, where they changed the date of inauguration from March 4th to January 20th. So they have their empire, and they're getting ready to use it for their final push of getting rid of the Dome of the Rock and making way for the building of the Third Hebrew Temple, which is why Trump is called Cyrus. That's why the Muslims gave him the sword dance, because they're loving the fact that Trump's going to get rid of Shia Islam and to build a Third Hebrew Temple, which the Masons in Islam want also.
No, it's interesting. I think that you can see that the power elite, the papal nobility in Europe had been trying to use the fact that we had a very large population of African Americans here. And I think that they wanted them here whether they were slaves or not. They wanted a population of people here that could be used to become a fifth column in this country. It's obvious that King George III was trying to inspire revolts and trying to inspire, he claimed that he would reward and free any slaves during the American Revolution that would take up arms against the Americans and any of the slaves. So they were trying for a long time to use the African American populace, whether free men or slaves in this country, as a weapon against the sovereignty of America. So that was a continued policy that continued on. Yeah.
After all the slave rebellions, it was all incited by the British.
There was plenty of African American black men in America who were freedmen who also owned slaves.
That's right.
So that was not a thing. ForgottenBooks.com. Guys, you guys have to check out ForgottenBooks.com. It's just a really wonderful outlet. Forgotten Books is a London-based book publisher specializing in the restoration of old books, both fiction and nonfiction manuscripts that are hard to find, almost forgotten and lost to modernity, right? So we have some really incredible books here on ForgottenBooks.com. And as we look through, I'm just looking through some of the headlines here. And it's incredible. Like I can see here that a lot of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's books are here. So I could see studies by Malachi Taylor on Ephesians. Fascinating. I can see here an essay on church government by an unknown author, right? As I go through here, over 1.3 million forgotten or lost or all but lost books, right? The history of the so-called Jansenist Church of Holland, the moral concordances of St. Anthony of Padua, right? All this incredible books, guys. All these incredible forgotten books. A sermon on the death of Abraham Lincoln, right? This is incredible. This is an incredible resource. The secret instructions of the Jesuits, right? All these. ISIS Unveiled. Wow, this is incredible. ISIS Unveiled right here on ForgottenBooks.com. Guys, you got to come check it out.
And if you read the book by Hollis Reed, who was a Bible-believing, born-again minister, he took 7 years to write that book, The Hand of God in History. And he asked the question, why the slave trade and why were blacks brought over here in the providence of God? And he concludes the reason why was to teach them our ways of our high civilization. I mean, Nathan Bedford Forrest said he taught his slaves to stop eating bugs and to eat meat. He says to teach them our high civilization and our arts, and then to go back to Africa and make a great African empire out of Africa. That's what he says in his book written in 1856, Hollis Reed, The Hand of God in America. And that could have happened. See, that's why the Jesuits have crushed every Back to Africa movement. The last one was in the 1930s. They crushed it because the blacks of this country have reached the highest development of any other blacks in the history of the world. And if they would go to Africa, they could develop oil. They could do all sorts of things. They're adept in money and development and politics. They could do it if they wanted to, if they continued to read the Bible, as Liberia was. But you get them all away from the Bible, you fill them full of sin, they lose their national identity, you have them stay here, never go to Africa, and they're losing everything. And they're going to go to the camps, just like Hillary said. We have to make these black men heal because they commit crimes every day. You know, I maintain they commit 100 rapes a day in this country, black on white rapes, and 10 murders, black on white murders every day in this country. So they've weaponized them against us to weaken us, so that we can't resist what the Jesuits have planned for us in our Sino-Soviet Muslim invasion and also our two-front war that's developing.
Now, if you look historically in the South, the African Americans, let's say after the Civil War, after they're freed in the 1860s and 1870s, and you fast forward through time, through a few decades up until the 1900s, the 1920s, the 1930s, the African Americans in the South were Christian families with really profoundly strong Southern Baptist churches with strong family roots of marriage and families who are educated, had very low divorce rates, very low crime. So what happened there? You can see that this period of time where we went from JFK assassination to LBJ, we can see that the black people have just it's like they've been betrayed by the American deep state into this culture of crime, into this rap culture.
And their own leaders. They lost their leaders. When they lost Marcus Garvey, they lost a great leader. Of course, the Catholics in the government at the time, during Wilson's regime, they sent Marcus Garvey back to that island that he was from, Antigua, I believe, and because he was a national hero. And he said, the black man has more hope in hell than he does here in America. And he said, in 100 years, there will be a race war. And he said that in like 1820s. So Marcus Garvey, a Lord Freemason, said many truthful things. And Malcolm X quoted him many times of the need for black nationalism. But they will not allow black nationalism. The only black nationalists are the bogus Black Nation of Islam that doesn't want black nationalism. It wants agitation, and it's Masonic to drive the white people into the new right. That's what it's about. So the blacks have been betrayed by their own leaders. I told a bunch of blacks I was speaking to in Atlanta several years ago, I said, black man, I said, all your leaders have betrayed you. There's not one that wants anything to do for you. And I had a big black guy come up to me. His name was Derek. And he said, finally, somebody said it. And I said, well, I'm supposed to, brother. I gave him a copy of my ebook. But they all know they've been betrayed, but what are they going to do? I've had black students say to me, Eric, what are we going to do? We know they're going to kill us, just like they killed Malcolm X. I said, that doesn't give you the right to stop saying what you need to say. So I've always advocated racial separation under nationhood. The blacks of this country need their own country. I've advocated giving them the entire state of New Jersey, everything, the farms, the airports, the railroads, all of it. Give it to them. If you can wage a war for 20 years in a pagan Muslim nation and spend trillions, why can't you give that money to them to have their own nation here? No, we want the agitation. The agitation cannot be allowed to cease. And it's the same way in Israel between the Muslims and the Jews, the Arabs and the Jews. That agitation cannot be allowed to cease by moving all the Muslim Arabs out to the nearby Arab states and give the Jews their own country. That will not be allowed. Neither the government of Israel nor the Muslim states around them in Egypt will allow that.
Yeah, it seems like enforcing that dialectic is trying to have this two-state solution where you're putting these two parties who are energized against each other and forcing them to be neighbors. And the same thing is true in California. You can see that they passed this law where it's got no funding and no financing and no hope of actually coming into reality, but they just did it for the political effect of agitation, which is to say that all these people who had a slave ancestry are somehow owed $5 million. And so they passed that law, and then all these people are expecting that someday that they're going to get paid $5 million, and all it does is further this contempt, further this agitation between people, and keep this moving towards this race war.
Brother. Let's be clear. Further, there's a hatred of the blacks for the whites. They feed black hateful hate and racism. They're the biggest racists anywhere. They're much more racist than the whites. And the black Africans know that. And they have told me we're nothing like those people. So that's what they do. They feed the racism of the American blacks to get them to commit acts of crime and whatever, to justify more absolute power. They're just pawns for that purpose. Malcolm X knew that, and that's why he advocated black nationalism until he found out that Elijah Muhammad was a traitor.
Yeah, it did a lot of damage. This whole process of like forcing the students during the 50s and 60s, of forcing them to all go to school together, not allowing people to have their own cultural heritage, not allowing them to have their own communities. People should be allowed to be around their own people, Yeah,
it's called freedom of choice, freedom of association. We've been robbed of our freedom of association. There was a time when white people could only sell their house to other white people in the area because white didn't want to live around blacks, and blacks didn't want to live around us. So, this forced mixing of water and oil only produces explosions, and that's exactly why they did it. That's why the Jesuits did it. And to show, I have a guy sent me a bunch of pictures with Martin Lucifer King with a bunch of Jesuits. He's speaking at Santa Clara University, and I think he spoke at Crichton and a few others. The Jesuits were totally behind King, forcing race mixing and miscegenation on the people that were the blacks and the whites didn't want it. And I grew up then. I experienced that.
It's very strange because Michael, he renamed himself, or he was renamed Martin Luther, and it's very provocative. It's just like how you take some of these like Muhammad Ali individuals and rename them with a Muslim name. They renamed him Martin Luther King, and it's a very strange kind of provocative parallel where he was put forward by, and you're right, he was always speaking at these Jesuit universities.
Yeah.
Was he aware of what the history was there? Like,
of course, he was a highly educated man, and he was handpicked to do this, to make this leading. He's a brother Freemason. He was Boule Society, as Steve Coakley came out and rightly showed. And that Jesse Jackson was a party to his assassination, which Steve Coakley also proved. He was a black guy who spoke years ago. He was murdered, I think. So, no, that's exactly what they've done, and they will not allow any black, like the gentleman I have on my website, Manning, who wanted racial separation. He was a Christian man. What they do, they ran him off the road and killed him. So I have another book called Race and Reason. The guy who was founded Delta Airlines wrote Race and Reason. His name was Carlton Putnam. And he quotes a black minister saying, we don't want race mixing. We don't want miscegenation. We want to preserve our people and our heritage and so on. And that's in his book, Race and Reason by Carlton Putnam. You got to get it. But no, can't have that. You might have black people that have purpose and morality and want to build something and teach our children. We won't have all these illegitimate bastard children running around that talk to hate white people and have no discipline, because that wasn't that way in the 20s and even the 30s. And they had their own schools and they had their own black teachers. Black children don't want to have some white person teach them, and rightfully so. There's a woman in Chicago, I forget her name. She had a school for blacks, and she was teaching them Shakespeare in about the 5th grade. Mm-hmm. They were accelerating in everything. Why? Because they had a black teacher. She had the right to discipline, to spank them for their disobedience, and they had real excellence. Well, we can't have that, so we're not going to have any discipline of the children. Let them do what they want to do, and hence we have all this black savagery in this country now, and now white savagery, which is getting right up there. So.
No, it's interesting because they destroyed the schools. You think about how awful it must have been to be taken out of your school, forced on these buses as a little, black school kid to go to these schools where you're hated. You're totally hated. The whole community's been in an uproar. The entire government's in an outrage over these individuals being brought in, and now you have to suffer. So that was the process. Think about how they said that people's education suffered during COVID. The kids, imagine how badly the process of educating these kids deteriorated at that time by forcing them to be, what would you say, forced. What was the term for when you had to go to these different schools?
Integration.
Forced integration.
Integration.
Right. And it's totally amazing because now if you watch the process of degeneration over time, you can see that now the schools, these kids, they can't read, they can't write. They don't even try to teach them handwriting anymore because they can't write. They're passing them through. I was reading an article recently where a young woman tried to go to college and she started to sue the school board in her area because she was passed all the way through high school, given a high school diploma, graduated like a magna cum laude or something like that, and she couldn't read or write. So when she got to college and sat down, she couldn't do anything, and she's been destroyed. Now she's in her 20s. She's never, ever going to learn. There's no way to catch up.
Is she black or what?
She's white. So this is just universal through the schools now. The school systems that through the 60s, they took the Bible out of schools. They put in the Roman Catholic holidays. You got Easter, Christmas. You got St. Patty's Day. You don't have any education. You just have this inculturation of Romanism going on there.
That's exactly correct. And there's no one who hates the blacks more than the Romans, than the Roman Catholics, because I was raised with them. Every black was a nigger, and if you were nice to them, you were a nigger lover. So that's what they called me, because in my senior year, I had a black girlfriend, and which I was wrong in doing that, but still I learned a lot from her and her culture. I used to go visit her over in Parchester Village, and that's where all the blacks lived. The whites lived in Montalban Manor, and the blacks lived in Parchester Village. And I used to go over there, and I had some very dear friends over there. I had one friend, he was on the football team, his name was Tony Green, and I went over to his place, and the outside looked terrible, and the inside was perfect. It was beautiful. It was well taken care of and clean. They had stereo system. I said, hey, Tony, tell me why your outside of your property looks so bad with weeds growing up everywhere, and the inside of your house is immaculate. He said, I'll tell you why, Eric. It's because the niggers will come by and pull up our plants, destroy what we put out here, so we just don't do it anymore. That's what he told me. So there's a whole lot of black people that can't stand these savage blacks that have ruined their culture, ruined their homes because of forced integration ultimately.
Yeah, it's a process of destroying the cultural legacy of each of the parties and to
Right.
move us towards this race war. And you can see, I don't know if you've been noticing on social media, but the young people, the criminal culture has gotten totally out of control. And so you have places like Chicago where they're talking about the Brandon, the ridiculous mayor there. I don't know how mayors have so much power over what happens in the courts, but I think it's like a conspiracy going on where they're saying they're not going to arrest. You can't incarcerate your way out of violent crime, he says. So they're going to stop arresting people. So these
Yeah.
people realize that they can run the streets, they can have these mass, all these kids can get together by the hundreds and tear up businesses and beat people up and run around the streets and no one's arresting them.
Yeah,
So
yeah, beat up the white people, destroy their businesses. That happened just down in Louisville. My son talked about it. Where these bunch of savage blacks surrounded this white girl, and she was trying to get out of it with a car.
Yeah.
And she finally got out of there, ran a few of them over, and the cops arrested her.
yeah.
They didn't arrest any of those savages. So the purpose is
They were stomping her car, they were
people,
jumping on her car, they were kicking her
jumping on
windows.
her car, the typical 9 yards of what they do, And so that's why that guy that was a very prolific writer, he said, just get away from them. And that's right. What we have now is black fatigue, because you've been victims of their savagery for the last 60 years, and the white people can't run away anymore. There's no white flag because you don't have any money to move away. And so now when you get rats cornered in a corner, it's going to be virtual fighting under the death, and that's what they want to justify the implementation of martial law. And then they're going to bring out their huge freight cars with chains in them, and they're going to put them on those cars. They're going to send them to the camps.
Well, the people have been, their cultural morality and their ability to, like, this is generational now. So now each generation, these kids are growing up as bastards with no parents, no fathers in the homes, and all these babies, mamas, all these different kids have no like actual family union within themselves, and they're being encouraged to become a crime wave. So it's it's a total disaster. It reminds me of Lord of the Rings, like an army of orcs that's coming out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're just there like a wave of locusts just destroying everything. They can't be educated. Right. You can't, there's no way for them to learn. There's no way to back up and the momentum of this generational degradation and curse, and to go back in time and somehow like bring back the discipline and the self-restraint that you need. It's not happening.
Right. And they've also, part of this too, we can't forget, is this radical feminism. Because remember, black culture is always feminist. It's always matriarchal. And matriarchs can't raise men. They can't do it. It takes a man to raise a man. I was friends with a gentleman out in Oakland, California. I met him several years ago. And he told me, he worked for the sheriff's office, and he said that what the Indians do with these wild African elephants, he said they bring in a big bull elephant. And they put him in there with them, and they all calm down, and they all behave themselves. He says that's exactly what needs to be done in our culture. Black men need some big, bold black men to take charge, and this is the way it's going to be, and that'll reverse it very quickly. But you can't do it.
It doesn't seem like it's on the cards. Yeah, it seems like this progression, this kind of avalanche of crime is going downhill in these certain areas. It seems like it's almost like a bomb is being set off in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in certain areas. And it's not really so much black now. I mean, there are a lot of like white Antifa communist people that are, young men that are starting to engage in this kind of outbreak of crime and violence. And so, I don't see how this can really be brought back into order. It's going to go from bad to worse.
Right. Well, that's why this military government's purchased 2 billion hollow point rounds. Because when you shoot somebody with a hollow point, it rips out where it exits, and it's very hard to stop deaths. And by the way, hollow points are illegal in war, but they have 2 billion of them to use on the people here when they impose their martial law, military martial law. Yep. They're all planning for it. They got the weapons, they got the ammo, they got the camps. Everything's in place. They just need the trigger to putting it into motion.
Yeah, if an extreme event takes place, like imagine like a series of events, including the something, God forbid, but like the detonation of some kind of weapon that destroys the Capitol building, something that just totally just galvanizes the entire country towards outrage is going to really kind of crystallize this whole thing into place.
Yeah, and that's what the Jesuits want. They want American people to hate the Congress. And how can you not hate it for what it does? And the Democrats are nothing but a bunch of communists, and the Republicans facilitate it. So there's no difference. They're both run by the papacy. And that's why J. Peter Grace called everybody in the Congress 535 clowns. He was the head of the Knights of Malta, Project Paperclip, brings in all these Nazis, working with Spellman. What they wanted to see was the end of the American Congress that would justify more power in the hands of the commander-in-chief. And that's what I maintain they're going to do.
Yeah, I think that the Congress has no power now that I can see. It's completely broken. They don't have any power except for the ability to vote yes on more and more debt, so that we're getting into 40, 50, 60 trillion now. And now Trump, for whatever people say about Trump, he has now created the largest debt in human history over and above all the previous presidents before him.
Well, yeah, he's inherited a lot of that from Biden, but he does nothing about it. He can say to Scott Bessent, you know what? We are now going to go back on the gold standard. We're nullifying Nixon's proclamation in 1971 to give some stability to our currency. Second of all, we're going to repudiate the national debt because it's only owed to the Federal Reserve, and they created all this credit. Federal Reserve is run by the Pope and the Knights of Malta. So we're repudiating the national debt, and we're going to come out with a stable currency that's backed by gold, and so we can have some stable economy. It could be really easily done, but they're not going to do it because they want the economic crisis, the agitation, the race war, the lawlessness to justify calling out the military and putting the whole country under martial law.
So as we move forward down that line, you can see that the currency is becoming completely, it's beginning to get to this point where we're moving towards a mass hyperinflation, where the buying power of the dollar is a mere fraction of what it used to be. The wages are not going up. The costs are going higher and higher. So the pressure is mounting here for families, for Americans. And you can see that illegal invaders are given all the money that they'll ever need to stay in hotels or to buy their own homes, while Americans are being just bankrupted out of existence.
Right. And the blacks ought to be furious about it. This is our country, and you're giving all these alien Hispanic Roman Catholics all this money. You're giving these Haitians all this money to settle in here and get cars and all this stuff, and we have nothing. The blacks ought to be furious about this alien Hispanic and black invasion, but they have no leaders to lead the way to resist it. So that's why I say the only solution out of this is for leading men of their communities and even in their states to advocate declaration of independence and resume a sovereign nation status once again, because Washington, with its military government run by the Jesuits of Georgetown, is going to completely decimate this place between economy, race war, and foreign invasion. Got to declare independence. No secession. Can't secede. Texas versus White, 1869. But you most assuredly can declare your independence. And Pennsylvania would be a great nation once we declare independence. I was talking to a cop yesterday. We need to declare independence, Terry, and go back to being the great Pennsylvania that we once were. We had all industry. We had iron. We had ore. We had mining. We had everything. Great agriculture. We don't need District of Columbia.
No, you're right. I noticed recently there was kind of a massive exposure of Roman Catholic power in America. It was recently had to do with, which it's kind of been under the surface there for a long time, but it has to do with this removal of Joe Kent. I think he was like an intelligence officer in Trump's government, and for a long time he was kind of going under the wire. But he had been, for whatever reason, I guess we're going to find out soon, he was under investigation and he was no longer allowed in the intelligence briefings. And he recently just quit and went on his way out the door. He blamed he made a big thing in his resignation letter, was going to blame Israel and blame everything that was going on the Jews. And this caused a sudden reaction through, I guess it was Steve Bannon, it was Nick Fuentes, it was with the guy they called General, what's his name?
Flynn.
Yeah, General Flynn. The entire kind of constellation of Roman Catholic influencers, including Candace Owens and Jack Posobiec, they all just kind of emerge in the background in social media in this attack posture against Israel and really against Trump. And so you can see with Alex Jones, everyone is really attacking Trump And it seems like as we approach the midterms, they're doing everything they can to make sure that the Republicans lose. That's how it appears to me.
Yeah, well, see, I believe, as Gerald Celente said many years ago, we're going to have a third political party. Now, that Roman Catholic Italian hates Protestants, but he did say something truthful. And I believe he's absolutely right, because that's just what happened in Germany. The conservative party in Germany in the 20s was the Zentrum. It was called the Center Party. And Franz von Papen was the head of it. And Nina Malti became vice chancellor under Hitler with Hindenburg's help. So they did away with the Center Party, which would be our Republican Party, and they put in the right-wing ultramontane, even Nick Fuentes knows that word, ultramontane, over the mountain, fanatical Jesuit New Right political party of the Nazis, NSDAP. So I say that's what they're going to do here. They've got all their New Right fanatics in place. The Joseph Goebbels being Cardinal Fuentes. And Jones and Tucker Carlson are following that, what's Jack Pasinski? What's his name? How do you say that last name?
Jack Posobiec, yeah.
Jack Potovic. So he gave them each
and General Flynn, same thing. So,
he gave me a crucifixion. I gave him a
rosary. Right.
So they're building it. It's obvious. It's fanatical Roman Catholic New Right. And the Protestants are totally quiet. The preachers don't say anything about it. So for evil to triumph, good men must do nothing. And that's what they're doing.
I think that these Protestant churches in America have been completely taken over. I know that the Jesuit order, part of their mission statement and part of the plan that they operate under is to get control of these pulpits and to kind of do a clandestine effort to control the churches that are their adversaries. And you can see that all these Protestant, so-called Protestant Baptist churches in this country, they practice Christmas, they practice Easter, they start to do these communion traditions in their church where they start to do like a little communion wafer and do like a little shot of grape juice in a little cup. And they're little by little, they're becoming Romanized. They're becoming a counterfeit Christian churches that are becoming more and more represented by the cultural influence of Rome. So
most of the ministers are Freemasons.
Right.
I was on a broadcast years ago, and I talked about some Masonic rite, Mahabone and all that stuff that they do when they whisper in the ear of the initiate in the third degree. And a guy called me up and says, "Where did you hear that?" I said, "Well, I have it in a book here." He said, "I need to talk with you." I said, "That's fine. Talk to me." So he came down to the radio station. We talked, and he said, "Well, I want to tell you that I was a Mason once and I got saved." I said, "Well, good. I'm glad to hear that." But he was against me talking about Mahabone and the secret Masonic word that the worshipful master whispers in the ear of the third degree guy. So they've all taken over. They all regard themselves as adepts. And if you're not in the Masonic Lodge, you're nothing. And so all the Protestant churches have been taken over with Scottish Rite Freemasonry and other things so that they have no resistance to Rome. And they're all members of the World Council and National Council of Churches, which is run by the Jesuits too. So they're totally gutted. All these beautiful old Protestant church buildings are empty. And so that's where we are. We have no foundation to resist the power of the papacy right now.
Yeah, if you rewind the tape back in time, if you go back and look at the historical legacy of American churches, they didn't practice these Roman rituals. December 25th was always the winter solstice. It was always Saturnalia. It was always a dedication to sun god worship. And Jesus Christ was not born on December 25th. So this is just kind of like a invention and an innovation of Roman Catholicism over time to try to merge their system of ritual with the ancient mystery traditions. And I noticed that Mormonism, Roman Catholicism, and Freemasonry are the big centers of religio-cultic power in this country who practice Christmas or who observe the winter solstice ritual.
That's exactly right.
Protestant traditions in the past, they never did. It wasn't something that they...
The Puritans of Massachusetts outlawed it while they expelled the Jesuits. I mean, those were true Bible-believing Protestant protesting the claims of Rome, Bible-believing men.
They were very observant about what was happening with Rome and what was going on with the Jesuit order. And right at the time when our revolution would kick off, the suppression of the Jesuits was underway, and they must have been off balance, to say the least. the Jesuit order. So it seemed like an opportune time for the American patriots to attempt to fight for their freedom. It seems to me, based on the comments by like John Quincy Adams and other presidents, that they were very aware that Freemasonry and the Jesuit order were their adversaries.
They were only 120, 130 years removed from Oliver Cromwell. That's completely vanquished the Jesuits, kicked them out of England. That's right. And so they knew full well that this was what Cromwell did and that ultimately we'd have to do it. But the Jesuits got in with the First Amendment that we're just going to let anybody in here, and the papists should never have been allowed in here that call for the death of anybody else. So it's called the Baptist First Amendment, but the men who gave us our liberty, most of them were Bible-believing men. I mean, you have Ezra Stiles calling George Washington our American Joshua. He was no conspirator. And so we had a wonderful government set up. It was the closest thing to biblical government ever established, but the Gentiles. And then the Jesuits set off to destroy it. And if the Jesuits had not been suppressed in 1773 by the Pope, there would have never been a successful American Revolution. We'd have all gone back under England, under the Anglican Church, and the Protestant, particularly the Presbyterians, would have been crushed. Because the British soldiers used to round up the Protestants, put them in the churches, and set the churches on fire. So that shows the Jesuits ran the British government under George III.
No, yeah, that's just an implementation of the Inquisition and the furtherance of the Counter-Reformation. It makes me think of the War of 1812. It makes me think that they were desperate to try to reverse the progress that the American Revolution had made after they kind of regained control, because you can see that the Jesuit order would reverse their suppression and come back into full power in 1813. So the 1814. The War of 1812 seems like an attempt which would roll into 1813. That war would, but they were desperate to have the British invade and attempt to regain their territorial holdings there in North America.
Yeah, that's exactly what they wanted. And had it not been for two white Protestant Calvinists, it would have never happened. That's Sam Smith, who saved Baltimore, and Andrew Jackson, who saved New Orleans. Without those two victorious battles led by those white Protestant men, we would have lost. We would have been brought back under the British control because the Jesuits ran the king at the time, King George III.
This reminds me of Albert Pike. He was an individual who I was arguing with some Freemasons on YouTube who were saying that he was not a racist. But if I go back and look carefully at his comments, he was a terrible, awful racist. He
hated black people.
He really
did. He did. And he becomes the secret head of the second of the Ku Klux Klan that went underground until the second one was brought into existence, the Stone Mountain, Georgia, 1912 thereabouts. So no, Klan, he hated blacks. Albert Pike was a very evil, wicked man. Why, he was pardoned for his treason by brother Freemason Andrew Johnson, because he used the American Indian, I believe it was the Sioux, to kill some 700 Lutherans up in Minnesota. So he hated the Protestants, he hated the Bible, he hated blacks most assuredly. And that would set the stage for black legitimate grievance at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. I just watched an old movie that I had seen years ago called To Kill a Mockingbird, with Gregory Peck.
Yep.
And in the South, those white men at the time, they called all the black men boy. Hey there, boy. And treated them despicably. And so all of this is a result of the Reconstruction, because they don't want black supremacy in the South, so they're going to keep them down. So they keep them down unrighteously, which will feed the Civil Rights Movement in the 1930s that the Jesuits will advocate, using A. Philip Randolph and John Lafarge, who was the chief Jesuit in charge of it.
And Martin Luther King Jr.
Martin Luther King Jr. King reported to A. Philip Randolph. Both were Freemasons, and A. Philip Randolph reported to Jesuit John Lafarge. I have a picture of them both sitting together in Lafarge's book. So
yeah, no, that's been reversed now, because now they call all of us white men white boy. Just recently, Candace Owens was talking, Nick Shirley, he's been made famous for his exposure of the Somalian fraud in Minnesota. She was, Candace Owens was on there complaining about him. She's very jealous, I think. And she called Nick Shirley a white boy. And so that's kind of the trending cultural thing that you have now. And you can see that, I think you're right, Roman Catholics have always historically hated blacks. I've never seen any Roman Catholic blacks, except for one, unless you have like an archdiocese in Nigeria or something. But generally, there are no black Roman Catholics. And then you have, of course, an individual like Candace Owens who kind of comes into play. And she's a very useful idiot. And I don't think she understands what Roman Catholicism is by any means.
Well, she's got a rich white husband. She's got a baby that's a mulatto. It's half white. And so now she's going to attack him by calling him a white boy. Dick Gregory did that one time years ago on Hannity. And Hannity said, "Are you going to call him a white boy?" And Gregory then said, "Well, no, I won't say it." But they always do that. They'll call you a white boy.
Yep. Yeah, that's the issue I think we're going to have here. The next stage of this kind of cultural degeneration here in America is going to be this race war. I think that we have done our level best as Americans to try to avoid it, and we've all been very enlightened, and we've all been very, very open to and not racist towards other people. But this racial dynamic is going to be enforced on us, and we're going to be pushed into our. It reminds me of like prison. You might not want to be a racist or be a part of a racial gang, but as soon as you go to prison, you find out that you can't be a part of the black clique, and you have to sit with the whites at the table.
Exactly right.
You have no choice. Even if you want to be liberal and you want to be open-minded and not racist, they'll still beat you up, and you'll still be forced to go sit with your own kind.
And the Supermax prisons are all like that. If you want to read about the black savagery, you read G. Gordon Liddy's work, the autobiography of G. Gordon Liddy, Will, W-I-L-L. He'll tell you about a white guy in there that these blacks gang raped him anally, orally, and 25 or 30 of them. And he tells you exactly what happened in prison there. It's with the book Will by G. Gordon Liddy.
Gotcha. Yeah. That's part of the kind of furnace of degradation that's kind of overtaken America. I think Islam is also growing really quickly in prisons, and that has everything. It's very strange to me that I think Muhammad referred to Africans as raisin heads, and he was very racist. And Islam was one of the great engines of slavery of Africans.
And I mean, it wasn't a slavery where they treated their slaves well, like Protestants did and Baptists did. It was a cruel slavery, a British slavery, like they pulled off in the Caribbean. And so the Muslims were very cruel, and the classic work on this is A History of Slavery and the Slave Trade by W.O. Blake. It's 1,000 pages. It was written in 1860, and it talks about the Muslim slave drives, where they would go into Africa, northern Africa, and beat the drums and drive the slaves to a mountain area, and then they would capture them and take them off to the slave market in Cairo. And the lead slaver, the guy leading in the slave march, was a man named Muhammad Ali. So when they gave Cassius Clay that name of Muhammad Ali, there was a joke on him.
Right.
Because the biggest slave trader out of Egypt, that was his name.
Well, the whole putting of Islam on black people in the first place is a disgrace.
A disgrace.
And it's actually the vestiges of the slave trade and the domination of the slave trade by Islam that there are so many black people that are still slaves, and in Africa too, in northern Africa, the Janjaweed militias. They're not free in their mind, because they're slaved by this system of religious demon worship and culture, and it's like a murder cult. And now they're taken over by it. When once they were African tribesmen, but now they're actually the ones who are enforcing that horrible slave trade on others. It still occurs in Africa. So
right. Well, I had a deacon in my church. He lives in Ohio, and when he was in Iraq. And he said whenever he would go into town, he said the Iraqis would laugh at the black American servicemen, point and laugh. They hate them. The Muslim Arabs hate the American blacks, and they're going to prove it if they ever invade here.
Well, that was a quick hour, Pastor Eric. I thank you for your time you spent with us. We have just kind of like hit the tip of the iceberg. There's so many different issues we need to talk about. I hope we'll continue to have this opportunity to speak with you and have these discussions.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I'm happy that there are those who will listen to our exchange, because there aren't very many. But thank you for having me on, and may the Lord bless you, Sean, as you do the Lord's will according to his word, the AV 1611 Reformation Bible.
Amen, Pastor. Thank you very much, and let's talk again soon. Hey guys, it's just another quick break here. We got to take a minute out to just remind you of our incredible sponsor, Wendy'sLimited.com. Wendy's Boutique Limited has the most incredible selection of boutique couture and just the hottest catalog selection of designer fashion trends. And you're going to get a good look at Wendy's personal closet, and you're going to be able to get a chance to see what she's been into and what she is recommending as the hottest new designer trends out there. And of course, she gets the best deals, and she's on top of like everything that's coming out that is just the most incredible, beautiful women's apparel and jewelry and shoes and just everything that makes beautiful women so incredibly, vividly beautiful. And we just want to recommend Wendy's Boutique Limited. Wendy'sLimited.com has just been such an incredible partner for us. We need you guys to go over there and check it out. Wendy'sLimited.com is going to give you a good deal. I think right now, for the rest of the month, if you go over there and do an order with her, you're going to get 10% off. You're going to get 10% off your first order if you go over there and do an order for the rest of the month. So just go ahead and let them know in the notes there, and send them a note, an email that you heard about Wendy'sLimited.com at the Looking Glass Forum. And Looking Glass Forum is going to get you an incredible discount. So I hope you will support us and support our incredible sponsor, Wendy'sLimited.com. Wendy's Limited Selection, guys. You got to check it out.